Now, all these officers had studied at West Point, which was the training ground, of course, for Army officers, and they had developed this strong sense of professionalism there, group identity, as I said, belief war should be fought by professionals, not citizen armies, and the training at West Point emphasized, as I said, small armies capable of rapid assaults. The hero was Napoleon, with his slashing attacks. He had big armies, but Napoleon was the master of the quick slashing attack to get the enemy off balance and sort of destroy him before he even knew what was happening. The basic principles taught at West Point were those of a French, or a Swiss actually, writer called Baron Jomini, Jomini, Baron Henry Jomini, who influenced Civil War strategy in profound ways, although not for the better. Jomini was the one who emphasized being on the offensive, using a small army, moving quickly, etc. There was also out there another military theorist, Clausewitz, the Prussian, but no one knew about him. They didn't read Clausewitz until after the Civil War. Clausewitz understood that the French Revolution had changed warfare. Mass armies, ideologically motivated, with modern weaponry, turned war into violence without limit. It was no longer going to be conducted by the rules of the game. War was mass violence, and that's how you had to think about it. Jomini was in this tradition of limited warfare, limited fighting, limited objections, what he called chivalric war. War fought almost like you were knights in the Middle Ages, not organized assassination. But that's what the Civil War, of course, will become. And Jomini misses what Clausewitz, of course, famously says, war is just politics by another means. The interconnection of war and politics, Clausewitz sees, Jomini does not see it. They're separate realms, and that's the training that the U.S. and Confederate officers had. So these principles are executed again and again in the Civil War. Jomini principles: you concentrate your forces, you make a massive attack on a single point, you try to win a decisive battle. One army's on the offensive, one army's on the defensive, and it's better to be on the offense, he said. The side on the offense is better, they can maneuver better, they can decide when the battle is going to begin. That's where you want to be. Well, Southerners who were on the defensive could use some of Jomini well, like concentrating your forces if there's going to be a single battle. But technological innovations made much of this traditional treatment of warfare obsolete. Part of the modernity of the Civil War is, as I said, the Industrial Revolution coming to war. It's the first war in which the railroad is used to carry troops in large numbers. Maybe it was done in the Crimean War a few years before this. Actually, the Crimea is in the news right now that I think about it, right? Today, some of them want to secession again from Ukraine and go back into Russia. But anyway, the Crimean War, but no one knew about the Crimean War. No one in the United States had any idea what had happened in the Crimean War. The railroad becomes a major factor, and railroad junctions become major targets. Chattanooga, Corinth, Atlanta, Petersburg. Why are they attacked? They're not big cities, but they're railroad junctions. If you can disrupt the railroad, you can interfere with the movement of troops of your enemy. The Civil War was the first war to use the telegraph to transmit information instantaneously. It was the first to use ironclad ships, right? The Monitor and the Merrimack, people have heard of them. The Merrimack was the Confederate ship. It first came out, started attacking the wooden-hulled Union, Navy vessels out off of Virginia, and they couldn't fight it. The Union then came forth with the Monitor, and they fought. But this was the beginning of armored warfare on the seas. Another modern thing, although not military in this sense, is it was the first war to be photographed. First war to be photographed. Photography at that time could not take action photos of battles. What you had was either this, which is set scene. As soon as the battle ended, the photographers rushed onto the field to photograph the dead. Rather morbid. And then those photographs were instantaneously circulated, north and south. As Oliver Wendell Holmes, later great Supreme Court Justice, says, he's a young man, he says, the camera took the dead and dropped them on our doorstep. It dropped the dead on our doorstep. You could not avoid the real look of war because of the photographs, which were very shocking to people, of course, to see this. But the main technological innovation, even above all of these, is a very simple one, which is the modern rifle and bullet, which completely negates all the principles of Jomini, which had been taught at West Point. Let's see here if we can find our rifle. No, this is, here we go. All right. This is a rifle, right? Everyone knows what a rifle looks like. This is a Civil War rifle. What's the big deal? Well, in the decade or two before the Civil War, the modern rifle had been developed with the grooves in the barrel to impart spin to a bullet, and then the shape of the bullet from being round to being what you know as a bullet today, a conical shape. And the combination of the rifle, it's what's called the rifled musket, really. But those two things give this weapon a tremendously more deadly power than the previous weapon, which was the musket. In the American Revolution War, but they've used the musket. Musket was a totally inaccurate weapon. It frightened people because it made a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, but you were unlikely to hit anybody if you were more than 50 yards away from them. So, but the rifle is, along with the so-called mini bullet, which was developed by the French in the 1840s, gave these rifles tremendous range and velocity. And as I say, before the Civil War, the musket was very inaccurate. Today, in the war, these rifles were deadly at 250 yards. 250 yards, you could start picking people off on the other side. Because of the new rifle and bullet, the Civil War becomes a war of what they call rifle and trench. Instead of marching around in the field, armies entrench themselves behind barriers. By the end of the war, you're really looking at World War I, not the older wars of the 19th century, where you have mass armies behind fortifications of some kind or another. In that situation, you've got to be on the defensive. The defensive has all the advantage. No matter how many men you have in the North, you cannot overrun entrenched armies with modern rifles. Stonewall Jackson, the great Southern general, said, "My men sometimes fail to drive the enemy from his position, but to hold one, never. Never can you get dislodged from a position by an assaulting army if you're entrenched like that." So the bayonet charge, forget it. Cavalry charges, they had a lot of cavalry running around, but no, they would fight other cavalry, but in a pitched battle like this, they were kind of useless. The defense adapted much quicker than the offense to this, and you still have all through the war these assaults by armies which lead to horrendous casualties and don't really accomplish very much. But again, this gives a great advantage to the Confederacy. They're on the defensive. They've got these rifles. The North has to dislodge them. They don't have to go and invade the North, even though they do a couple of times. So the Civil War is the first war from which almost all the wounds were from bullets. One surgeon said, "I only saw 4 or 5 bayonet wounds in the whole war, apart from people falling on their bayonet after they got drunk at night. Self-inflicted accidents." But no, there's no, there are pictures there in the wilderness, there's some hand-to-hand combat, but no, the armies start further apart and they end battles further apart. And this is what makes armies mass killing machines. This is what results in the massive casualties of the Civil War. The 700,000 or so deaths, of which maybe 400,000 were Union and 300,000 Confederate. This is all estimates. There's no official count on this. And the total wounded brings casualties up to maybe 1.5 to 2 million if you count killed and wounded. Again, that's in a total population of 30 million. Not only did the war kill as many men, as I said before, as all U.S. wars combined, but for the South, you know, of the men of military age, the death rate, of course, is that much higher. The Battle of Antietam, which we will talk about, 4,800 dead. More Americans died on, I guess it's September 20th, 1862 than any other day in American history. More Americans died at Antietam than at the Battle of the Bulge, on 9/11. The bloodiest single day in American history was the Battle of Antietam. And as I said, the greatest casualties were in these attacking armies. The Confederacy lost twice as many men when it was on the offensive as when it was on the defensive. It was only on the defensive, on the offense twice. Once they go up into Maryland, once they go up into Pennsylvania. They lose far more men doing that than in the whole rest of the war because of the difficulty of being on the offensive side. You might wonder why they attacked at all. We'll see that. Why did Lee invade the North? He didn't have to conquer Pennsylvania. He invaded the North for political reasons. He thought it would destroy Northern morale if he won a major battle on Northern soil. It would influence the elections coming up in the fall of 1863. Those are military things. In a war, those are military considerations because, as I said, the morale of the enemy population is a major factor in how the war is going on. So the point is, again, just the technological developments gave the Confederacy a great deal of advantage, and neither side was really prepared for the implications of industrial warfare. Moreover, in this kind of war, with these mass armies, mass casualties, neither army was ready to keep fighting after a battle was over. You know, Lincoln and others kept, we got to go and destroy them. After Gettysburg, he said, why did you let Lee's army withdraw back into Virginia? Because the victor was just as disorganized and full of casualties as the loser in a battle. Neither army was in a position to continue the fight after one of these giant battles. They had to regroup, they had to retreat. So the idea of destroying the enemy army was a myth, even though people on both sides thought that was the ultimate aim.